So in this video we're going to consider some objections to the kind of position that Wittgenstein has been sketching. And basically the thrust of the two objections we'll consider is pretty similar. It's sort of like, how could you possibly deny that words stand for things? How can you possibly deny that words refer to things? Isn't this just a totally obvious truism about words? And basically what Wittgenstein is going to say to both is, I'm not denying that words stand for things, and I'm not denying that words refer to things. What I'm denying is that you can give a complete understanding of what language does by using these notions of reference or standing for. It's turning the notion of standing for into a whole theory. That's the kind of thing that Wittgenstein is objecting to, at least as I understand it. So there are two ways of sort of running this kind of objection. One might be to say, well, don't we go around just saying things like water refers to water? Actually, this is a little bit more obvious if we think about other languages. So if we think about like the word eau in French, EAU, we might say things like eau refers to water, or eau stands for water. Isn't that just a true claim about French, that the word eau stands for water? Likewise, isn't it just a true claim about English that the word water stands for water? So how could you deny these things? Aren't they just obvious claims about how our language works? The other way to run the objection is to say, well, isn't it just obvious that we do, as a matter of fact, associate words with objects? So remember, there was this part of the Augustinian picture that meaning is learned by ostension. We learn what the words mean by pointing at the things that they stand for, and the language learner comes to associate the word with the thing it stands for. So another kind of general thought is, well, like, doesn't the fact that we do this thing of like pointing to objects and saying the words, doesn't that make it clear that what's going on is that we are learning the meaning of the word? We're learning what the word refers to. So these are obviously pretty closely related to each other. They're both different ways of thinking about the same objection. The objection being that, isn't it just obvious that words stand for things? Isn't it just obvious that words refer to things? So how could Wittgenstein possibly deny that? As I understand it, what Wittgenstein says here is that, well, it's true that we say these things, that like water refers to water, or eau refers to water, and it's also true that we do this thing of pointing to objects and saying words in order to get people to associate words with objects. But Wittgenstein thinks what's going on here is that this is actually these are kinds of language games in their own right. They're a particular kind of language game. They're like a gateway language game. They're a language game that you engage in order to get fully versed in the practice of other language games. For instance, the practice of saying things to people like water refers to water, or eau refers to water, is the point of doing that is to sort of let them into other practices, to let them in or give them a way of engaging themselves in particular kinds of language games which use those words. Again, this example is maybe easier to think about in the context of a foreign language rather than your own one. Saying things like "eau" means water. You can see how you can maybe begin to see how going around saying things like that might be the first step in getting somebody into a language game using the French language rather than the English language. And he says the same thing about the pointing example. What's going on when you point to objects is that this is another kind of language game of its own, the point of which is to get you into or get you able to play other language games. So for instance, the language game of like pointing at objects and saying words, go back to the shopkeeper example. The point of a language game might like that, of pointing to objects and saying words, might be to enable you to say the right things or write down on the note the right things when you go into the shopkeeper example. In both cases, he seems to be thinking there's a particular kind of language game of its own, namely learning the names of things. This is the language game that we're playing when people tell us things like water refers to water, or they point to things and they say the words. This is its own language game, and the whole point of the language game is to enable you to play the other language games that are related to it, to play other language games that use the word water. So that's one thing Wittgenstein says, is that when you see people talking about words referring to things, when you see people pointing to things and saying words, the way to understand what they're doing is not to necessarily like to take it literally and think that there's some sort of standing for relation. The way to understand it is that this is a language game in itself, a sort of gateway language game to other ones that use the word in question. There's one other remark he says as well, which speaks more to the idea I mentioned earlier about not wanting to try and turn this idea of reference into a whole theory. So he thinks there's something going on, there's something meaningful going on when we talk about words referring to objects. Like there's something real that we're trying to do when we use language, when we talk about language in that way. The mistake, I think Wittgenstein thinks, would be to try and turn that into a theory of language use as a whole. And here again, the idea is just the kind of one we saw before, which is that if you think of all the different kinds of uses of language, there's just so much variety. And there's so much variety, Wittgenstein thinks, that there's really no real notion of reference or standing for that could cover them all. Now, maybe you could make up some notion of standing for or reference that would cover them all. But because there's so much variation, the only notion that would really help us understand all these things, or the only notion that would truly apply to all of them, is something that would be pretty empty. There wouldn't really have much substance to it. Wittgenstein gives a really helpful analogy here. So he has this case about tools. And he says, well, like, the claim that all words refer to something is like the claim that all tools modify something. So you might initially think, well, like, all tools are used to modify some objects in some way. And that kind of seems plausible initially when you think about, like, hammers and screwdrivers and things like that. But when you think about a wider range of tools, it maybe starts to look less plausible. Like, think about a ruler. Like, we sometimes need to measure, or a measuring tape. Like, that's a tool that we use sometimes. What does that modify? Or think about something like a spirit level for measuring whether something is level or not. Like, what does a tool like that modify? And what he says about that case is like, well, maybe you could come up with some idea, some notion of modification, where spirit levels and rulers do modify things, and just like hammers modify things and screwdrivers modify things. The problem would be, though, like whatever sense of modification that would be is fairly empty. And it's importantly very different from the original notion of modification we had in mind when we just thought about examples like screwdrivers and hammers. Indeed, the notion you would have to come up with to cover all the different cases is so far removed from the original cases, you might really wonder whether it's really a useful notion at all, whether it really has that much content anymore. And this is exactly what he thinks is going on with the idea of reference as well. That maybe the word reference, like, you know, we're doing something real when we talk about words referring to things, but to try to turn that into an entire theory of language where all words refer to things and what a word means is for it to stand for something, that's really to kind of strain the original notion. To do that, we would have to make the notion of reference so inclusive that he worries it's not really clear it would have any content at all. So that's Wittgenstein's response to this kind of fairly flat-footed objection. So the objection was, like, isn't it obvious that words refer to things? Because we talk about words referring to things, and we point at objects and say words, and that looks like we're trying to establish what a word stands for. And I think what Wittgenstein wants to say is, like, in a sense, yes, words do refer to things, or there's something meaningful that we're doing when we say that. But that is just a language game in itself. This talk of words referring to things or pointing to things and then saying words, that's a language game that sort of inculcates people into the practice. It's their gateway into the language game, or a variety of different language games that use the word water. So it's not that there's nothing going on when we say those things, but rather it's a very particular kind of thing, and it would be a mistake to try and to turn that idea of reference, or that talk of reference in these cases, into an entire theory of language. Doing that would be like trying to turn the notion of modification, which is clear and which we maybe understand when we think about screwdrivers and tools, into a theory of tools in general. Just as that would be a mistake in the case of tools, Wittgenstein thinks that would be a mistake in the case of language as well.